Hello, everybody. As you may have guessed, I have a new table. It's a little more stable than the one I had. Still can shake if I rattle it, but doing pretty good. And again, I've made some videos talking about real world events that I saw or lived through. All right, relating to martial arts self defense and. On the idea that it will be useful to some people, or if not, entertaining. But again, I swear by everything I believe in, and much that I don't, that this is all true. So this is a technique against boxers and punchers, people that like to strike with their hands, that can preempt a situation. All right? So I became aware of this technique as I did a lot of fighting things in high school, because there was a lot of fighting in my high school and in my neighborhood, and I had a lot of fighters around me, and I had to be one. So this was in gym class at Nottingham North High School. So I went there between 1984 and 1988, graduating in 1988 with a high school diploma. So this could have been my sophomore year or my junior year. Not quite sure, but there was an altercation that looked like it was going to happen. There was a young black kid and a young white kid, and they were both kind of on the thin side. And I don't know what the argument was about, but I don't think it was about race at all, honestly. It could have just, this is New Jersey, man. People talk trash about each other. People, test each other constantly. And so it could have been any number of things. But what I do know is the young black kid got so mad he put his hands up and started moving around. Come on, man. Come on. And the white kid, he put his hands out and put his left hand like this on top of the right hand, and his right hand on top of the left hand, and they just kind of stood there, and the kid was like, fight me, and he kind of moved around, and the kid he had the hands in his hand, right? And it was a trapping hand. It was a trapping hands technique, but not like slap, boom, boom, not like Wing Chun, all right? And I watched it, and they pulled apart. And the young black kid was like, well, he's too scared to fight, man. If he'd let go of my hands, I'd have hurt him. And I was like, but you could have stepped back. You could have thrown punches. You could have re-gripped. And I realized, like, he did look like he had a little bit of boxing training, or maybe just seen a lot of boxing, and he was thinking he might have been in situations where someone on his block was like, hey man, let's box, friendly match, or they had a fight and they decided to duke it out, but kind of had a code of honor where you're not grabbing and you're not wrestling, right? And remember, this was the 80s. The culture was different then. In the 80s and in the 90s, you'll watch a lot of movies where there are fight scenes, even martial art movies, where somebody will take somebody else down, and instead of punching them while they're down, back up and let the person get up, and they'll do it again, right? And that actually was a norm. That was more of a norm. In fights, you kept to your feet, and you duked it out, all right? Unless you were fighting a wrestler, in which case they took you down. Gracie Jiu-Jitsu existed somewhere, but it wasn't in Hamilton, New Jersey, and it wasn't very much on the East Coast back then. So that technique registered in my mind, right? Fast forward, I'm now in the Marine Corps. I'm in my early 20s, and an argument arose over a fairly trivial thing. Like, this is how things can escalate. But we had an inspection, and it was like Friday, I believe. And what was at stake was, if we do the inspection right, not only do we get off duty, but we get to go home for the weekend. And we did not have a lot of cleaning supplies. That was the interesting thing. You had a lot of things, Um, it, you had a buffer, all right? You had some mops and some buckets, but not in each individual room. I think we had a broom, just kind of like a sweeping broom somewhere. But honestly, we didn't have it in each room. Now you would think the Marine Corps, being into cleanliness and also busy work. The Marine Corps is really known for busy work, as many military units are. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I was on a naval base once, and the Navy had contracted housekeepers to come by and clean our rooms. And I've heard of such things happening on Air Force bases quite a lot. Okay? So, but I mean, this was a barracks, fast company, Marine Corps Security Force Atlantic, Marine Corps Security Force Battalion Atlantic, Norfolk Naval Air Station. It comes flooding back. So we did not have adequate supplies for the really intense cleaning that we were engaging in, and I went looking around for a push broom, which you really need. And I remember knocking on doors. Anybody got a push broom? Who's got the push broom? We just had it. Sent it to so and so. So I knocked on a door, and they were like, they were not going to give it to me. But there was one kid in there. I think he was Colombian or Guatemalan. He had a certain look. If you've seen people from Guatemala and Central America, they have a certain look. I call it the jaguar face. All right, it's the only description I have. There's kind of like a cat-like eyes that look vaguely Asian, and the cheekbones, and it tapers down fairly square, and you see canines. I mean, look, you can't see my canines, but you could see canines, and this is a look in Central America. I call it a jaguar look, and my personal theory is that because the jaguar is like a sacred animal over there, anything resembling a jaguar is highly prized, and those people are probably highly prized as mates, and those genes perpetuate. All right, and conversely, that facial structure and the build tends to be kind of squat, broad-shouldered, and in the men, not running towards chubbiness, but not tall and lean. That's the description I have. So I remember this kid, but I can't remember his name. And he had, I think he was from Florida or someplace, and he had a really deep voice, yo man, like that. He would use the N-word, like, yo nigga, blah blah, but a tough guy, right? A real tough kid. And I know at one point he said he'd done Bondo, and he showed the Bondo salute to the four corners, and he was like, yo man, that motherfucking shit was some tough shit. I can't quite do his accent right, sorry about that, but he was in the room. He's like, yo man, you take that push broom, but you bring her right back. I'm like, alright man. He said, you better be quick. I'm like, I'll be quick. So I went to the room, and the thing is, you want to be quick, but you want to be thorough. So I'm being as fast and as thorough as I can be. And it felt like, to me, like barely had I gotten this broom. Then he comes rushing, and he's like, yo man, you got to give it back. I'm like, I got to finish. Yo man, you got to give it back. I'm like, I'm going to give it back to you when I finish, man. You let me borrow it. Now let me clean. And he kind of like, maybe he wasn't expecting me to be assertive. So we went back, and then he came back in yelling, and no, before that happened. So I finished my cleaning, and I didn't take my time about it. I cleaned thoroughly and quickly. Then I went to the door. I'm like, here it is, boom, and I threw it in there, kind of like angry. You want it? Here it, boom. And I went back to my room, and I can imagine, I think what happened was, aside from him being ticked off, his roommates were like, you gonna take that shit from that little short motherfucker? So he comes charging into the room. Yo man, how come you're going to throw that shit down? And, he was trembling with rage. And I put my hands on top of his. Left hand, right fist. Right hand, left fist. And he was in his boxing stance. So he's like this. And he like looks at the hands. He's like, and I didn't do it fast, but I just placed it on him. And I just kind of looked at him. And he was like, yo, man, I didn't appreciate that. And I'm like, well, I'm sorry, man. I moved this fast. And we actually talked. And he says, you know what, man? I respect you, man. Because you're different than most of these motherfuckers. You got motherfucking discipline. I'm like, all right. So are we cool? Yeah. And we were cool after that. I mean, we weren't like friends after that. And we weren't enemies. We were cool. And I didn't have too many interactions with him after that, beyond the course of duty. Like, hey, I'm here to relieve you on your post, that type of stuff. But I mean, I don't have any distinct memories of him after that point to when I was out of the Marine Corps. All right? But I mean, he was literally in a rage. He was like this, and he was loud, and he was like, and I knew he was thinking, if he makes a move or touches me, I'm going to punch him right in his face. But then I touched his hands. And he, not hard, but he felt the restriction of the movement and the fact that I was actually willing to touch someone who was in range, and I was standing in very close range. We could have headbutted, right, or bit each other. And I was looking him in the eye, and I was just deadpan. Let's fast forward. This would have been around 2012. And when I moved here to Missouri, that was January 2011. And this would have been about 2012. And I think I had my own, I had subletted. I had moved out of, a particular individual recruited me to come here and work for him. And it just didn't work out. The guy's an asshole. Right? Horrible to people around him, horrible to me, horrible to the kids in the house who were not his kids, physically abusive to the kids, which I later reported him for, and verbally and mentally abusive to them, and he attempted to do that to me, and no. So I had left that household, and without his permission. I'm like, I'm leaving. I don't need your permission. And so one day I was bouncing at a place called The Bridge, which I think isn't here anymore. During the day, it was a music school, and at night, it was a bar and also a concert venue, a lot of live performances. And I was a bouncer there. That was my night job. I had a day job and a night job. And he comes in there, and he tried to start it congenially, but I said, I'm not letting you in this place. What do you mean? I'm like, I have the right to deny anybody service. He's like, I'm not here to drink. I'm like, I have the right to deny you entrance. And then he realized, like, I think one problem I have and just will continue to have is that I'm fairly congenial, fairly happy, conciliatory, and if I was a D&D character, most of the time I'm lawful neutral, but I'm really chaotic neutral because I can be good or bad. I try to be good. Sometimes I'm bad. Just a human being, right? So a lot of people kind of don't know that there's a side to me that if I'm pressed, I will snap right back at you. If a threat comes, I'll react to it, okay? So the conversation begins to escalate. And at this point, we're yelling at each other. And he starts to move to put his hands on me. And I think what he was going to do was not necessarily an assault, but put the hands on my shoulders and kind of like shake me or try to put a dominating kind of pressure on me as a form of mental intimidation. And I put my hands out, and the minute, because we had trained together for years, okay, the minute I put my palms towards his palms, left to right, right to left, he stopped. And it's almost like that screen position. And our palms were, let's say, this close. All right? This was him. And he slowly brought his hands down, and then he kind of stepped up, and it was almost like in boxing and MMA where the fighters face off and they're toe to toe, nose to nose, except I kind of had to look up at him. All right? And I actually don't play that game. If people want to think that they've intimidated me or punked me or bitched me, I'm actually fine with them thinking that, because they're not actually doing it, because I stare at the throat. Okay? I learned this at the American Karate Institute from Rick Hahn, who I believe learned it from Grandmaster Dennis Dwyer. And the whole concept is, if you look at the throat, if you point your eyes at it, but not stare at it, and let your peripheral vision soak everything in, you can see everything the opponent does, and you can see out of your peripheral, and your awareness is not only focused on your opponent, but you actually are ready and able to hear what's behind you, and even psychic senses and intuitive senses are all going. And I just look at the throat, because if someone's that close, and I've let them that close, my next move is going to be to strike the throat and the groin, okay? And, continue, just blitz, okay? And we used to train a lot of our techniques where we'd be looking at the throat and someone's trying to fake you out. The minute, the second, the instant you feel an intent, you move. And at that point, there was a standoff, and, and he saw what I was doing. I wasn't looking at his eyes. I was looking at his throat. Just kind of staring. And, we during training, he'd be like, why do you do that? I'm like, well, that's my trigger. If you look at the eyes, you can be excited or intimidated. You can be lulled into a false sense of security. If you look at the throat, it's just a target. And it's one of the squishiest, softest targets on the human body. And it's far, far harder to be faked out when you're looking at that, but soaking it. And I even showed him once how this worked, because he asked me a while before that incident, like, what's your plan if you get in a fight? I'm like, I have no plan. He says, how do you not have a plan? I'm like, I have no plan. I'll look at the throat, I wait for a trigger, good things are going to happen. I spend most of my life trying to restrain this animal that I have inside me that's capable of immense violence. And the person that actually comes at me, I said, first of all, if you find yourself staring faced across from me as an enemy, you've done something wrong in your life. I don't go out looking for enemies. I cross the street to avoid trouble. If I'm making a stand and not backing down and looking at your throat, we had this conversation. I said, I'm not responsible for what happens. I'm not even going to be there. I'm just going to be spectating. This part of me that I spend my life trying to keep in check, stop from harming people around me in society and myself, it's just going to, possess me, and it's going to do what it has to do to survive, and it's your fault. And I think that probably came flooding back to him, and he backed off, and we began talking again. And as he went to leave, I'm like, one more thing. And he turned back around. I said, one more thing. I said, don't come back here anymore. I'm trying to make a living here. I don't go to where you work and try to stop you from making a living, making money. I said, there's something wrong with you, man. And he turns back around and starts stepping, and I get up out of my seat. And again, my hands are down. I'm looking at the throat. He said, I'd just punch you in the face. I'm like, it's not going to happen. And he looked, and more words were exchanged, and he left. So, covering the hands. I knew instinctively with him that if I touched hands, the fight would instantly start, and I didn't want that to happen. In the other incident, decades before, I touched hands because I knew the fight was on by the trembling and rage in the man's body, and I never had formal training in Wing Chun at the time, but me and my friend Scott would just sort of read the magazines and books and try to reconstruct it, and we kind of got pretty far with it. Because when I actually received instruction in Sticky Hands in Chi Sao, I was able to ride along with it fairly well. All right, so this is an obscure technique. I don't know what to call it. It's basically a form of preemption and prevention of rapid fire striking. It's grip fighting without a grip. It's clinch fighting without clinching. It's trapping with kind of sort of a trap. All right? And it's a strange transitional anticipatory moment in combat. And if any of you want to experiment with it and develop it, give me feedback on it, because it's showed up 3 times in my life and twice I was the user. Y'all have a nice night.